Welcome, everybody. My name's Kevin Sandler. I am a professor at Arizona State University and a member of the Animation Educators Forum, who organizes animation salons, which you have all joined us today. The Animation Salon is a series of informal Zoom lectures and discussions in which scholars or a practitioner or an educator shares their current project or their research and their pedagogy. And speakers are ranging from past Animation Educator Forum faculty grant awardees, such as the ones we have today, to educational industry professionals who will just present topics that span the rich and diverse field of practices and perspectives in animation. And the goal of this salon and all salons is to exchange ideas, to promote conversations, and to stimulate debate while expanding the professional and social networks of the Animation Educators Forum and ASIFA-Hollywood, as well as within the broader animation community. These are all live broadcasts through Zoom, as you can see, open to the public, and the broadcast will also be recorded. During the salon, Robert Morris University professors, Andrew Ames and Tim Jones, will be talking about their research into animation labs as sites for experiential learning. It's Reframing Materials, Best Practices for Inclusive and Accessible Learning in an Interdisciplinary Lab is its title. On Sunday, April 7th, we will also have our next salon, and this is also from a past faculty grant awardee. That's filmmaker Sheila Sofian, who will discuss Disabled: A Love Story, a 13-minute animated documentary that explores relationships and struggles of Terry, who suffers from multiple sclerosis, and her husband, John, who has cared for her since her diagnosis. And that is Sunday, April 7th. I will turn this over to Andrew Ames and Tim Jones in a moment, but just they'll be presenting their work and then open that up for conversation shortly thereafter. So, Andrew and Tim, thank you, and I turn it over to you.
Okay, without further ado, a couple introductions. My name is Dr. Tim Jones. I'm an assistant professor of media arts here at Robert Morris University and the director of the Academic Media Center, where we are sitting now. Andrew?
I'm Professor Andrew Ames, lead faculty in the UX UI program and the gallery coordinator here at Robert Morris.
So a little bit about how we're going to do this. I'm going to talk a little bit about where the project came from before the generous support of the Animation Educators Forum grants to take it to where we're going to be going. We'll do a little bit of a tour because we're sitting in the space that the forum helped us explore. Then Andrew's going to talk a little bit about how we implemented the project with students, and then we have some best practices that emerged from this project that we really look forward to discussing with you. So this is we're going to talk for a little bit, but then we want to use at least a third of the time that we have together today to be together and talk about this exciting thing. So the only other thing I think when I was thinking about how I wanted to introduce sort of where we came from here, I want to sort of shout out a particular place and a particular set of people. When we're talking about animation labs, I think it's impossible for us to, for me to not talk about how I became an animation educator, and that was because of the animation lab and the animation educators that made me who I am. So ultimately, this project begins for me in the basement of Mackey Auditorium at the University of Colorado, in the animation lab that Phil Solomon, Mary Beth Reed, and I guess Stan Brackage, with a little bit of interference from Trey Parker and Matt Stone, put together in the late 1990s. So some of the biases there and the opportunity sort of to pay it forward to some of those folks. Obviously, Stan and Phil aren't with us anymore. So I'm thinking of them as we talk about this. Same thing with Andrew. You want to shout out any of the people who made you the animation labs and the animation.
Yeah, so I was fortunate. We both hail from Denver for our undergrad, but I was at the University of Denver where the program there was highly experimental, and so we did things by the seat of our pants and would occasionally ask for things and get a toy to play with, and that's kind of how we operated. And it was very cool because all of it was experimental and nobody knew what to do first. And so we were always the first to do something.
So yeah, one of the things that's really exciting about this project is that when we've been talking to people about it, the whole conversation is about how important the space of animation learning, and for during the pandemic, how much we missed the idea that we were physically in a almost ritual location, which is the animation lab on so many of our campuses, in our homes, in our studios. It's just a physical place that we really started to realize how valuable it was in our pedagogy as instructors and our creativity as artists when we weren't in there with our students. So first thing, it seemed appropriate that we are in that space. So I'm going to stand up. Welcome to the Animation Lab in the Academic Media Center here at Robert Morris University. It is small but mighty. We're, as in so many of these spaces, we're in the basement of a library building. This used to be an adjunct faculty office, but the students started asking for things. They started putting posters on the wall. Frozen, you can date when things start happening by things like Detective Pikachu and Spider-Verse and She-Ra on the walls. But it's a physical space where our students sort of explore, figure out what kind of animation they want to make and what kind of creative professionals they want to be. So for me, as someone who's an animator and industry studies scholar, I started sort of as soon as I started working here, I started poking my head around the corner and going, oh, what's happening in there? Not just what are my students making on the Dragon Frame station or on the disc or on the Cintiq or behind us at the Lego workstation, but also, how are they interacting with each other? And increasingly, what kind of students are they? And how are they finding this space? Because we're not easy to find here in the basement.
Well, and we're in a totally different building also. So the primary home for our media arts classrooms is a 5-minute walk across campus. So accessibility is challenging for some students. There's a whole group of students that may not even come over to this side of campus for things, right? If they're just in graphic design, for example, they may never show up over here.
And for those of you who are, for those of you who may be on the northeast of the United States at the moment, this is particularly true at the beginning of a spring semester when the word spring does not seem to be accurate and there's a foot of snow between us and the dorms and the places where the students are working. So it seemed to be the right time to start thinking about accessibility and inclusion in these spaces. And we realized as we started looking around 2015 to 2017, as I was coming here to RMU, just how little published research there is on the animation lab in a university or higher education context as a place, as a site of learning. There's a lot of research on the media production classroom, particularly in film and television, from folks like the Edit Media Initiative, out of Emerson, work by people like River White and Miranda Banks. Some really interesting work about education in media production, particularly inclusion for students of color, students of varied economic backgrounds, women, female identifying students, very little specific to animation. At the same time as there is some really fantastic research coming out about questions of accessibility and inclusion in our industry. So we started putting some pieces together, thinking, well, we don't have a whole bunch of information about the animation lab. We don't have a whole bunch of information about how we can, as educators, create an inclusive space for animation learning that will begin to solve some of the issues that folks like Women in Animation, ASIFA, various entities, some of whom I see are some of the names in the room, some of whom are represented in the room today. We haven't really made that connection. And then COVID happened, and the idea of accessibility in the space became even more pressing when we realized that simply, initially we were allowed to have one person in here, and then we weren't allowed to have anyone in here at all for, I think, a semester and a half.
Everything was pretty well closed down.
So, of course, the wonderful timing of the announcement of I believe we were the 2020 cohort, that we had this opportunity to put all of this into an initiative that we called Reframing Materials. How could we create inclusive and accessible practices for an animation lab at the time during COVID, and now how can we sustain those changes as we're coming out? So that's where the project came from. What we set out to do was to deal with two particular things that we found very, very interesting. We read a lot of the literature that was coming out in inclusive pedagogy and media studies in general, and started looking for things where animation and visual effects and game education were specifically mentioned. And every time it was specifying that so many of their most talented, economically disadvantaged, neurodiverse, female identifying students of color were all choosing to opt out of live action, crude production, and moving into animation and visual effects. And then Andrew and I were in a meeting at lunch, as we often are, and looking at the sign-up list for our animation studio. And lo and behold, it was, although we're a pretty small program, we're a small university, about 3,800 students, of whom we have about 20, 30 students in any given media cohort at a time. But that's a very small sample size, but we noticed exactly the same thing. So we were noticing that for questions of accessibility, the only students who knew about our animation lab were the students who were told about it specifically by one of two people. Which meant that from an accessibility standpoint, you had to be enrolled in a class already before you even knew that there was a thing that you might be interested in. Whoops. And lo and behold, on top of that, the students who were choosing to do that had already made a active and proactive decision about a question of inclusion, which was a negative response to their experience in the media education environment in general. Of course, we're not speaking about, we're no longer speaking only about our institution. We're going, wait a second, our tiny sample size was matching something. And we started looking, doing a sort of snowball analysis and going, this is a big thing. So we started looking even further for where is the research on animation labs and animation lab practice. And we found something really interesting, that almost all, and this is true 3 years later, almost all of the work we could find was undergraduate, master's, honors theses, and doctoral dissertations by students. the universities as a rule and us as academics were not ethnographically studying our own spaces. We largely weren't doing a whole bunch of assessment either. So in absence of scholarship, published scholarship outside of theses and dissertations, and an absence of quantitative and qualitative data, but a ton of students commenting on what the practice environment looked like, how accessible it was for their particular learning needs. And a lot of comments about the idea that animation is a refuge from other kinds of practice. And yet, a lot of the attributes they were referring to are all about benign neglect, that they were able to do interesting things, learn particular things that they wanted to discover, identify and become the people they wanted to become, because the institutions that were housing them weren't paying much attention to what they were doing. And here we are doing this research, coming in saying, hey, we want to make our space more inclusive and more accessible. And the very people we thought we were looking to be serving are the people going, oh, things are going very well here. Please don't send those people in with us. We're having a very good time. So space for very interesting conversations. So the final thing we started to do was, what is a research project that can discover and explore what is going on, what are the practices that make an animation lab accessible and as inclusive as possible, that we can start looking at, that we can expand and offer out beyond our particular academic context. What can we implement in a way that does not break what we inadvertently discover is already working? So do no harm. And what can we do to make sure that whatever we set in motion can be sustained beyond the limited institutional memory of students who are here, best case scenario, 4 years, 4.5 years seems more likely right now. But that whatever the student structures are put together, that they don't disappear as soon as those students who had established ownership of that space have left it. So we set in motion we brought in those students. We started, the Animation Educators Forum allowed us to formalize the position of the students who were already here, to codify their residence in this space in a way that our institution understood, that they became lab assistants and grant assistants and these kinds of things that were simply formalizing the fact that they were already here. And we started exposing them to the institution and began to see what was happening. And once they started to produce some interesting things, we started to then expose those students and those artifacts to the classes again.
Yeah, so we were fortunate. We started off with a student, Devin, right? And Devin started producing artifacts that we could leave in the lab. You know, he did a stop motion animation film, but he also produced a kind of a how-to manual for the things that he was doing that got left behind. So the next student already learned from his mistakes. They had a jumping off point and could quickly dive into the hardware and the software that already had a steep learning curve. He helped level it out. But as we had our next student come in, they looked at it and said, you know what, I can do better. And so they made the manual easier to use, and they made it more legible, and they reduced the curve even further. And that was their artifact that they got to leave behind.
So we'd see students create something, they're creating these kinds of artifacts that were not the kind that we were expecting. We were expecting there to be attributes of the films that they were producing, and they would be showing in classes or in screenings in our community, all of which was great. And they were obviously producing these much harder to track professional identities that we could ask them about. But then we started discovering these things that were lying around in the space. Lego animation made easy. And they were responses to each other. In the case of this student who made this little guide, he looked at the dragon frame thing and said, well, I don't like dragon frame. I like using my phone to make my Lego animation. So the exploration materials that they were leaving behind were responding to each other in a way that we've sort of intentionally left the lab in a somewhat messy state after last semester, because they leave these things around. What we were not used to seeing was things like these sort of animation educator .com tutorials, the bouncing ball that shows up in a lot of animation labs. These things were left there for them, but they started to have these things that were iterative and belonged to the students.
And they would just keep taking them further and further, right? They would do examples that they were interested in. Bouncing ball is great, but when you want to animate a dragon, a ball doesn't help you. So they were producing the things that help each other animate the things they're excited about. Emma was great. She was our last animation assistant, and she helped take things even further. So she reproduced some of these artifacts, but then also started surveying our students and our peers to learn more about what they needed in the space. So she came to visit classrooms and did surveys and asked students what they knew about animation, what they knew about the space, if they knew how to get to the space, so that she could then further improve things like signage, which was non-existent. I mean, the school has a limited budget. There's not much they want to throw out as far as like, oh, let's get signage to a specific thing, but the students are willing to make those things to get others excited about it.
And one of the things that we were really intrigued about that it never really occurred to us, so we thought, well, if you put up a sign, then students know where to come. Students will only look at a sign if they think it's relevant to them. So it was a really interesting question that we didn't set up. The students put it into their survey. They said, who's the animation lab for? And we had never thought to specify, in a sense, beyond the door being open, that it was an open access lab. Although all the other labs in our facility, our television studio, our radio station, are sort of well established as being open to any student on campus to use, the assumption and the sharing of information from student to student is a very interesting dynamic, that we can say all we want about the lab being available to any student to use, but if the only students who use it are in very particular animation and user experience classes, then it doesn't matter what we say, the effective accessibility is then closed off. And that gets to something that is really interesting about the difference between animation education and other kinds of media, that we do have a substantial amount of control in class. And there's a lot of really interesting scholarship about the amount of control the media educators have in class for creating group work, compensating for different levels of experience, different economic backgrounds that students might have, so you can sort of control the opportunities for learning. We really have very much less control over what our students do outside of class. And when it's animation and the amount of time in production is as substantial as it certainly is for our students, certainly what we were experiencing from our own animation education, we just realized just how little as a percentage of the exploration identity development for an animation professional we have eyes on. During COVID, we didn't even control where they were located. They weren't working in the lab. So again, we looked at what students are saying, and this huge growth of online animation clubs affiliated with universities during COVID suggests that there's this huge amount of identity work and exploration taking place, but all of the work that has been done around equity and inclusion is assuming that as the professors, we have eyes on what's happening. So our objective here is to identify what the learning community that is in here, both because of what we're doing and also in spite of what we're saying, and then use the materials that the students shared, the students are creating, to observe, start to assess, and as much as possible not interfere with, to the extent in which we can see the benefits of it, the community, the accessible community that the students form, and then develop best practices based on that we can then share and observe and see whether we can start creating something that is valuable for other animation educators outside of this basement. So what I'd like to do is really just sort of show you the end result of the project, and sort of we'll refer a little bit back to where some of these examples came from. And then we're really interested in hearing from you what resonates with our experience from this project, what is different about your environment. Like I said, Ames and I, we come from an experimental animation background. This studio is very much a stop motion studio, becoming a VR quill studio as well, as students are pushing it that direction. Very much not a multi-role rigor lighting, animate, CGI environment. But we're really excited and interested in finding out whether some of the best practices our students and the student community have generated resonate in those different kinds of labs. And if this can become an artifact of this project that could spread and be useful in the Animation Educators Forum, in the obviously the organization that funded the research, also the Animation Educators Caucus in the Society for Animation Studies, and the Animation Special Interest SIG of SCMS are the other organizations that have really been involved in here. But without further ado, I'll share my screen and show you the first set of best practices our students helped us put together. And I should also add that this is coming out very soon as there'll be an article in publication that we will share around with everyone once that is through the lit review process as well. So the first set of practices that came out of the Reframing Materials project refer to the things that our students wanted faculty to know about making the lab more accessible to them, more inclusive, and more relevant to the kinds of things they want to learn, and the kinds of other students who they want to bring with them. So the first one we titled Expand Animation, asking for, the students asked for us to cover a diverse application, recognize that there are a bunch of different reasons that students would be interested in animation, a bunch of different things that the students were considering animation, and applications they might use professionally. The second one?
Is to level the playing field, right? So every learner is coming to the lab with different levels of experience. And so we wanted to make sure that they had access to the things they need so they could learn quickly, hence the little artifacts of quick start guides. Providing tools, providing things to animate like Legos, leaving clay behind, having the pens, paper, the punch just readily at hand for students to be able to jump in and start animating.
Now, the third thing, they wanted us to have tools and they wanted us to make them available, but they asked us specifically not to be gear snobs. They wanted the lab to, and the way that people talked about, the way it was introduced to them, to foster a healthy attitude towards tools, recognizing that the tools don't make the animator makes the animation.
And then they point out that they need to be shown the way. So more tutorials, getting our hands dirty. Again, the leave behinds are showing them the way.
And they wanted us literally to show them the way. The idea that not just passive forms of access like signage, but opportunities for people to take them to the space and give them an opportunity to make it feel their own. So the idea about bringing the student to the space, encouraging them to make an artifact and leave something behind that was theirs.
And that's, brings us to the last one is to share ownership, right? And responsibility for the inclusive nature of the community. So students, inviting students into the space has been important. Having Emma, our animation assistant, come to classrooms and share her work and invite students into the space in the hopes that they will then make it their space is probably been one of the bigger ones for us.
So responding to that, and again, the idea of having multiple best practices for different kinds of users is something that we and the students borrowed directly from the Edit Media Initiative. The idea that there's a student 7 best practices they created, and then Edit 10 with 10 best practices for faculty. So as those things were coming along, we started building a second set of best practices about inclusive student use. And that first one was to ask students, don't sweat the small stuff, telling them to be prepared to screw up a lot, and if possible, to enjoy the screw ups.
Yep. And part of that is, a lot of failure happens, and students are not prepared for that. And so giving them the space and the encouragement to come in and screw up has been highly important in getting them comfortable with doing this.
So our second one was this idea we called "Don't Go Chasing Waterfalls," asking our students to set iterative goals. That came in a large part from the fact that we at RMU are not a traditional arts program. A lot of our students here are business students or engineering or nursing students, and agile methodologies for iterative development are some things that the students from outside of our curriculum are learning about. And they're really pushing this idea about, again, doing things in small pieces rather than one big project that was going to define them.
Because, at the end of the day, I'm going to ask them, can we do it better? And if they've done a big thing, they probably don't think they can do it better. They've finished the thing and they want to be done. So setting those smaller goals and doing the small experiments, it feels a lot better to be told, you need to do this again, because it's manageable at that point. Our next one is to make sure that you give yourself time and then double it, because animation is time consuming. So having the space for students to have the time and come and animate has been important. But getting them to realize just how long things take, that's been a bit of a challenge.
The fourth one, which as we started talking to the students about it, really made me feel connected to my own space as an animation student, and I'm interested in asking the audience about how much you feel about this too, is to make space for others and share time and space. One of the reasons I mentioned University of Colorado at the beginning of this is that so much of my own animation experience was claiming the couch outside the animation lab. A disgusting couch, but it was the couch I slept in while I was working on my animation projects. And I have fond memories of that, but it doesn't share the space. It is a literal marking of territory in a way that is not welcoming for others. As much as we like to talk about the things that students leave behind, there are inclusive leave behinds that are supportive, and then there are territory marking leave behinds.
Yeah, and I think we're doing relatively good with the leave behinds at the moment.
They've stopped being dirty dishes from the dining halls in the
Yes.
last couple months.
You know, the leave behinds are the quick start guides. They're Lego sets that they used and have left behind for other students. They're Legos that they bought for their animation and have left them behind, have not been, you know, I bought this, it's mine. I bought this, I got something out of it.
At the same time, we are cognizant of the cost of Lego, and it's very interesting when we notice that broken action figures that get left behind are in some ways far more useful than Lego sets.
Yeah.
And finally,
to embrace diversity of approaches, right? Very rarely are these right or wrong. We do have students that animate in very different modes and have very different needs when it comes to their animation. From students that just need space and to be left alone to students that can only bring themselves to animate flip books. And, you know, part of what we're doing is being okay with the things and the tools that they want to use to do their project.
So those particular best practices we want to really stress are evolving from our context, but each one speaks to an interesting combination of sources and references from within animation education, but also within the literature of inclusive media pedagogy, but also things that look very interesting from the perspective of what would it mean if those best practices are used first by students who are doing stop motion Lego animation here. What does that look like when we switch to a rigging, lighting, multi-stage, multi-team process? What happens when there are collaborations, virtual collaborations between campuses working on the same film? We're really interested in seeing how these best practices could reside not just on the wall of our lab, but in modified, iterated, and non-waterfall format in other spaces across our forum and across the communities that we're in. So that's it for the sort of formal part. We're really interested in what you think, what resonated, what infuriated you about the process that we took. What would you like to see us, our students, and the folks who are working in this space of trying to document and study animation labs, what would you like to see happen next? So we'd love to have a conversation. And thank you again, I'll say this again at the end, thank you again to the Educators Forum and ASIFA-Hollywood for funding this.
Yes,
it's been amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah, please, just if you have a question, turn on your unmute yourself and please ask away. Well, I'll start off with one question. As being part of a film and media studies program in a Department of English at Arizona State University, that will have students who are interested in animation, but who may not be part of a small animation program in a fine arts school. I'd like you to, tell us more about how you went about, making people aware of this opportunity that you guys had in around Robert Morris to kind of engage interest for people who didn't know it was there and didn't see the sign.
Do you want to handle that? Do you want to handle that on the class side, and I'll talk about it on the extracurricular side?
So on the class side, Emma was visiting classrooms that weren't ours, which was helpful. But I was also able to teach some classes outside of media arts. So I was teaching an honors class where I was able to introduce stop motion Lego animation to students across campus, albeit the honors students, but they're in nursing, business, chemistry, actuary kids, all who never thought they would animate a lick. And at the end of the class, well, 2 weeks really was kind of the segment for that. Students were animating stuff and coming in to use the space. And we had a handful of students that continued to come in and use the space for their own projects because they, were used to doing business and needed a creative outlet and discovered that this was a space that they could do it. Yeah.
Yeah, the other side of it is extracurricular. Because we are a funny space, so we're not part of student life and we're not fully part of a department, the Academic Media Center. So the traditional approach at this university and a lot of others for this sort of thing outside of classes to sort of make the space a clubhouse that belongs to a student life organization. And for us, we just sort of felt like that's just another way of creating the sort of a wall around the space, even if it is really exciting and a big step beyond the class plus club. I think our Lego club at the university, some of our games clubs are like that. The problem with that is that those are very much entities that last like 4 years, and then their institutional memory is gone. So what we were really interested in is that we started talking to the students who were here about inclusion and access, and discovered that they were really interested in those topics. And that allowed us to ask questions about, well, you are this, you are a media student or you're a nursing student, what else are you? And honors was one way in. We discovered a lot of the young female identifying students were honors, or they were members of our women's mentorship program. Other students were members of Greek life. The rowing team, we are very, I think 1 in 10 of our students are student athletes. Mm-hmm. So rowing team, track and field, they were all more than one thing. Oh, the band, I shouldn't forget the band. Mm-hmm. So the finding out that they were more than one thing meant that there's sort of these conversations about bringing in someone else who had shared an interest and letting it sort of spread in a snowball way that way. Would love to find out more about that. How there's one thing is that's a thing that seems like that works at a small university. I wonder how well it works at a Penn State and Arizona State. I certainly can't imagine how that would have worked when I was at UCLA. So that's a thing that we're interested in finding out more about.
Yeah, it's a challenge to wrangle. And certainly a challenge of when you have a lot of group of people working on similar projects, you run into issues of trampling on other people's kind of programs or students and stuff like that. So it does take a commitment for everybody to be open to serving students in some kind of interdisciplinary manner. And I think each program is going to be unique in terms of how they kind of navigate that, certainly at a large university such as ours. Hugo Glover has a question.
Hi. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for such an interesting project. I can't wait to read your paper that you're writing about it. So I'm over in the UK. I'm in the northeast of England. Had some very similar experiences, but the one question I had for you was about failure and about how you frame failure. Yeah, how does that go down?
I mean, we baked it into our program objectives for user experience. So we try to introduce it to the students as early as possible, and get them comfortable with the idea of things are going to bomb, and that's okay, provided you're taking something away from that, right? If they can show me a failed project, but tell me what they learned from it, they won't get an F on the project.
It's for me, it's a place where I need to be really, I need to be humble with the students about it, because it's especially when we're talking about coursework as compared to extracurricular work. When they're having fun, when they're playing around, especially with things like the Lego animation, there's a sense of lower stakes, and failure can be fun. We noticed that when we were talking to students about it, it's very different. I come from a position where I'm in the classroom, I'm teaching storyboarding. When I'm teaching storyboarding and I hear about students who are in a thesis film class, their attitude towards failure is very different. We're not at this, I think one of these things that's really exciting when we're starting to talk about iterating and developing these best practices further. There's nuance and ways that we need to address things like embracing failure, because I can identify, and I wonder if there's other folks here who could speak to this, is there's failure early where that it doesn't hurt, and there's a failure at the end in senior year where you are done and you're not coming back to animation again. And we would hate to be creating these documents that would not be speaking to that in a useful way.
So I don't want to take up too much time, but a lot of the language you're using, certainly around notions of iterative progression, is that so I come from I come from design research, so all my work is into tacit knowledge within animation practice, and within design research and within innovative cycles, this language is well, this is the way that progress is made. Learning happens. When I've experienced sort of situations which are more bound to sort of creative or craft practice, that tends to be about staying within a safer creative kind of boundary, and the iterations are much smaller, they're much safer, and they are about kind of attaining a sense of quality. So the other facet I found fascinating was you talking about how varied the inputs were from all of these different practices, which just sounds fantastic that you can get the rowing team interested, for example. So I didn't know if design and design research and design pedagogy were in any way sort of a component or an active component of your sort of research sort of paradigm that you're working in.
So I won't say it's part of my I'm a designer. My background is experience design, web design, graphic design. So I come from that iterative creative process, but it was all experimental design. So everything we did had a huge potential of failure. And so for me, it feels like it's come naturally. So it's trying to imbue that in the students, that any level of iteration is a positive level of iteration.
And I agree with you. I mean, I think this is one of the things that's really exciting to hear is, I'd say from a craft perspective, and I think that was certainly true in my animation education experience, that it was what our engineering students would call waterfall development. And the different populations have a very different attitude towards it. We joke about the rowing team, but they're not about iterative. They're about the race is the waterfall. That's a bit of a strange metaphor for the rowing team, but
yeah, a good one for animation though.
But yeah, they don't. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. It's certainly our nursing students who are very active, and not so much in this space, but in the center. these are students who are thinking about qualifying exams. Even more so than our media students, they have a sense of like a deadline and a fail state or a success state. And I think this is a really interesting opportunity to look for the disciplinary place where the various disciplines and stakeholders define failure and iteration.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I don't want to take up too much time, but
No, thank
amazing
you.
work.
That's great.
Yeah, awesome.
Sandro, please.
Hi, thank you. And hi, Tim and Andrew and Kevin. I am at Arizona State. We don't know each other, I guess, but I teach animation in the School of Art. And so I was kind of like, it's a very interesting conversation, but I have to say it is challenging now. I just arrived this, last semester to be in an animation program that has 600 students projected for next year and no lab. I mean, except the computer labs. And I am bringing the idea to have this more intimate, playful, experimental lab and interdisciplinary connections. And I see the road uphill, but I welcome this exchange because, again, now I know, Kevin, let's talk. And again, I treasure what Tim and Andrew had found out, which would be ideal, except that I don't know how to implement that next year when we finally will have a lab that is more like a stop motion mix experimental / whatever you want to call it. I don't know because I see my question is like some of the lovely things that you guys said, for example, leaving something behind. We cannot allow, I mean, it can,
That's a little harder.
it's inclusive if we are few people, and it becomes exclusive when you start to clutter and nothing can be touched, and the next person who comes doesn't feel anymore that's the space available for them. So I guess it really depends on the number and the resources that we have. So it is both a question and
Yeah, so I'm trying to think as a designer as a moment at the moment, because you've got a huge number of students and how to make an intimate thing for that number of students. And there's no way to have like a room like this to suit that many students. So I start to think, well, how do you scale it down and down and down so that you could fit more? So what happens if you have like cubes that students can do little animations in, so everybody sees the animations that are happening all at once? Because then you could potentially just fill a wall full of cubes to create these little intimate spaces that are always visible and can be seen and shared.
I mean, we had the same thing with there's very much worth noting that we're not in the room across the hall, which is a computer lab with deep freeze computers. So there's this very, and quite oftentimes traumatic experience that I think I see nodding, and the traumatic experience of the deep freeze computer and everything is gone when they leave the space. So they have this very strange feeling of it hasn't mattered that they were there. Their artifact is destroyed. Whether it's their fault or not is another question. But so then there were little things like posters on the wall. And what were the ways of getting around the horrible conversations with IT about what was different about that room? So the conversations about like making sure that even if it was a computer lab, that the animation lab looked different than the room across the hall was important to the students. Mm-hmm. But even in that computer lab, the students requested paper ball lanterns.
Yeah, they wanted different lighting.
So they could turn off the ceiling lights. If you walk into that room, that's the only thing that looks different, that specifies that it's different from the other computer labs. And it's kind of interesting that we wonder whether that has a community component.
Yeah, our
We-
students
yeah.
hate lights being on.
Yeah.
Unless it's the lights they've picked out.
But we intentionally chose this space because, not just because the Lego animation and the stop motion dragon frame were the things that were happening when we noticed, but it has that problem that the students get to a point where they're really, really active in the space and the door gets locked because they're here from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. or 7 a.m. The campus police know they're here, but the door is locked because they got to be here. They're coming back the next night after they slept all day and missed my class to keep animating. And that's not like, yeah, all those wonderful things that we may have memories of students are not inclusive practices. We benefited from them because now we're animators and animation educators, but yeah, that's fraught for me. And I really appreciate just the scale of the problem.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, let's talk more. I'm really excited to hear how that goes.
Absolutely. I just want to say one last thing, that we have above me, there are so many layers. We're not, unfortunately, even with the new building that we hopefully will get next year, we are not free to configure the building the way we want. There are so many rules, so many like layers in this big university. But my proposal to my colleagues was to use the old stop motion room as a space for senior projects and students, just to have that freedom, the more like playful space where they can having their own lamps or having, touch things on the walls without incurring in any penalty or security checkup or anything like that. But let's continue the conversation. It's wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll be in contact with you, Sandro, as well, very soon.
Please. Thank you.
Maya, am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's Maya. Thank you.
Maya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. This is so thought-provoking and sorry, I had to unmute. Hi, everyone. My name's Maya, and just really appreciate this discussion and really also looking forward to the paper. And I think this is a really vital topic, given the necessity for spaces and labs and collaboration and all that good stuff. I had a couple of thoughts / questions. One of them was maybe kind of related, but like a tangent to what you're talking about, which is self-care. You were just talking about, like students staying 8 a.m. till 5 a.m. And, our students can get so immersed and just put in so many hours, but then neglect to stand up or look away from the screen or, the thing they're looking at and take some deeper breaths and things like that. So I'm curious, any thoughts you have about that or anything in the research that popped up related to that?
I mean, I try to address it in the classroom. Admittedly, I'm bad about giving students breaks when I'm teaching. And I tell them that at the beginning of the course. And so they take it upon themselves either to let me know, hey, you're working us too much, or hey, can I do something? And that's getting me in a better mode to remind them to stop looking at the screen. And so it's affected how I teach, that they remind me, and then I start to get in the habit of reminding them. But that's kind of the back and forth that I've kind of fostered with the students. I don't know how much of it came up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think a lot of the things is there's a danger of things sounding rose tinted. We're obviously very excited about what's happened here. One thing that we're not able to do, and we definitely don't want to do, as we talked about, like harming the communities that are developing and the inclusive practices that the students are inventing. But that sort of means we're somewhat limited in using them as data, right? Not only because the sample sizes are tiny, relatively speaking, but also that they didn't consent to being long-term subjects yet. And I think there's larger organizations that would need to be involved for that to happen across multiple schools. Because when we look beyond the animation lab at the student media and the extracurricular sort of landscape in general, we can see things that we can't share about the correlation between, you know, the amount of activity in student media, animation, games, all those things, and grades, and burnout, even things like, you know, really traumatic episodes that students might have because of something that was initially very helpful that they did, either like relationally or something like that. Like, as someone who works in a student media center, I see what happens when the students are all really excited working together, and then they get in a relationship with each other and fireworks, right? And that has a lot to do with like self-care and moderating and making sure that you're always safe when you're making these choices. You're making safe choices when you're excited, right? It's not always the same thing, but we don't have a mechanism to use that in this particular project. But the answer is yes, and it's a great question and needs to be looked at further.
Thank you so much. And one other thought or question too is just making sure I'm unmuted. Okay, good. Is related to communication, kind of what you're talking about. Is there, do you have any sort of philosophy or even manifesto about, you know, how to communicate within the space? Like, for example, I know in some computer labs, you know, a student may come in, there might be another student working, and they may not introduce themselves. They may kind of sit in a very isolated from each other. Not to say, like, not to force people to introduce themselves, but just some sort of, like I said, maybe manifesto for how to communicate within the space together.
I mean, that's our homework lab doesn't have one of those, and I often see students just, they wander in, and more often than not, a student will wander in that's not part of the program, and then they get shooed away. I'm on the fence on that, because they're often in there working on things that's not anywhere related to our students. They just wanted to find a quiet space. But sometimes it's nice having those different things in the labs. But there's also the fact that our students pay a different level of tuition too for those spaces.
I think it's an elaboration on, and it's a neat, I think, obviously I'm thinking on the fly, I think it's a needed elaboration to one of the best practices about sharing the space. This is something that's too recent to be in the project, but at the end of last semester, I was walking past, not this lab, but one of the other ones in the other building, where there was a student and she was braiding another student's hair while he was working on, or they were working on their project. And another student walked in and was not included in whatever that was. So there was what didn't appear to be an entirely healthy social interaction. And I think it is sort of there was a benign or unaware like territory marking practice going on in that space. That came out of how comfortable they were. Obviously, you know, one person was just there while her friend or colleague was working on their project and just being there for them, and this other student didn't have that experience. So, I mean, I think it's an elaboration on that that is going to need more data, more input.
Thank you so much.
Question. In the emails and the marketing that we sent for this salon, there's a picture of your students and I think you in front of a cinema. And I'm wondering how that, if at all, is related to the inclusive learning practices that you're doing and the community building efforts that you're doing.
Good question. Yeah.
So yeah, the screening was all animated works that happened while we were doing this project, and so it included animations from the honors students that were doing Lego animations. It included animations from my class and Tim's class and Carolina's class, so we could bring all of these folks together to see the different kinds of animations that were happening on campus.
This is another thing that's another possible elaboration. I think that having these conversations and what other people seeing it from the outside, because in the last, again, just the last few weeks, as we did our senior and we did our various in-class screenings of work in class, a student remarked that in class we have lots of celebratory practices for the end of where they are critiquing, and even if they're getting a good or a bad grade, there's a celebratory practice of watching the artifacts they've made. That doesn't exist outside related to this room. So one of the things that screening did was an opportunity to have a ritual aspect of just everything that gets screened, and opportunities to share and celebrate that work. And in that, we've been sort of lucky that there's other organizations here in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Film Office, and the consortium of all the universities are setting up are supporting student-run opportunities to screen and pitch work to each other. In that case, that's University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, Robert Morris, Point Park, Chatham. We have a lot of universities around here. But the idea that these tiny sort of communities that are otherwise isolated in our lab versus whatever might be happening in Point Park's labs, that there could be screenings that the students would have the opportunity to celebrate with each other. And in that case, we're kind of thinking that really all we're offering there is to pay for it. And that obviously, again, is a scalability thing where in our context, that might be $200 or $300. I'm guessing at ASU with 600 students, not so much. So that's, the screening was a really big part of it. Students got really excited because an alum showed up and wrote about it for a newspaper.
Yep.
And that was a network because a student was friends with a journalism student who graduated and thought this was something that was newsworthy, and that obviously made it an event for the students.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
I think Dory does.
Yeah, for some reason it won't make the little orange hand for me.
Yeah, I didn't see you. Sorry about that.
This is really interesting to me because I went to a small university college, maybe the size of yours, and then transferred out of there to Indiana University, which was huge, and then transferred from there to UCLA, which is huge, and ended up teaching at a small college university. It calls itself a university, but it was not much bigger than the small schools I went to at Woodbury in Burbank. And my experience as a student in both those environments and as a teacher in both of those environments is how radically different the cultures are. So I came from a small school where in order to get all the things you wanted to get your hands on to do the projects you wanted to do, and I was an artist at that point, you had to go out, you had to convince people in other programs you wanted to work in their space with stuff that they had. You really had to be a little proactive, but the school itself was more open to that because there were small groups and the teachers were communicating with each other at a better level than at UCLA, where you don't know any faculty outside your own department and they don't have anything to do with you anyway. So I had that experience. And then at UCLA, I was in the, Indiana University, I was in the media program and I was working on sound stages and directing people with giant cameras and doing all sorts of different stuff that you had to be collaborative within the space to get anything out of it because it wasn't going to do something by itself. And so that was a whole different thing I had to learn. Well, then when I came to UCLA, which I chose for my graduate degree because I could choose television or animation, and I hadn't made up my mind what I wanted to do. I ended up doing a thesis where I had to have I had live action shot, I had stuff shot in the field with a camera, a Bolex that I owned, I had animation I was doing, I had computer animation I was doing. I had to wrap everything together. So I had to figure out how to get into every space. And then ended up teaching in this tiny university, and the people who might want to get into my space were architects, or they were other places. And I was really glad of my experience of being able to try and work across different departments and stuff. And being able to accept them showing up in the animation program to do something. And the students were open enough because there was a good chance they knew the students in the rest of the programs. So, they were all eating together in one tiny cafeteria place. So it was I just think the difference between the two universities' sizes and number of programs, and it sounds to me like you have actually integrated different programs into your space. That is set up that way to integrate different programs into that space. And that the larger the university is, the less set up it is to integrate different programs into that space. I actually honestly think that the sort of deciding factor is I was raised by university professors on Purdue University campus. And so I had no fear about crashing into larger programs. But I think that it's would be really valuable as you're building this is to also get the big university discussion, because my feel is that the size of your program and the size of your university is aiding you in creating this multimedia, multi-department experience that is not easy to create in a big university where there's mega competition for funds and space and who gets the new building and all the stuff that goes on at big schools. So,
well, and there's a fair amount of competition and siloing at RMU. It's like finding the key faculty that are willing to come down out of their silo to engage and to encourage students to come do these experiences outside of their major. I think we're having relatively good luck finding those key faculty that are like excited, or they're coming and asking for a video or an animation. It's like, we need these things for our programs, and we need these things for these experiences we want to create. But that's also a huge burden that they come asking for these things because they have absolutely no idea how long they take. So it's a double-edged sword.
Well, it's the pathways are interesting. Like one of the things we sort of moved through it quickly, but it's worth mentioning is like looking at some of the student theses and dissertations where students are talking about how you do this, how do you set up like an animation club at a university, or how do you get access. The pathways, some of them are relevant to what we do, some of them are relevant to a bigger one, like from the student perspective, finding out if a club or a resource has ever existed, it's easier to bring it back than if it never existed at all, right? If it has a cost center, if there was a constitution or anything. Yep. And on the one hand, that's really useful and really interesting to talk about with inclusion, but guess who the kinds of students who are good at finding those resources and know how to get them are? They're the resource users. They're the ones who are, not surprising, faculty brats or students whose parent taught at their high school. We have a few of those here, and we see them go off to, and not coincidentally, some of them go off to grad school at larger universities where they're going to have the same experience that you described. So, we're really intrigued about it, and the scalability question for institution size is something really important to us as we take this further, because we know that our conditions are different, but they're also different from what we experienced as students ourselves.
Yeah.
Like, I really liked what the example about the idea about reusing an old space to do something specific because you can't ask for something in the new building at ASU. I think that's a really good example of this.
Yeah, and some of what we've done here has been a long game. I've been here since 2010 and have had to plant seeds. And every 5 years, it seems those seeds bloom into us being able to do a thing.
At the same time, you have to be really careful when you tell students about a long game because their sense of time is different. 4 years is forever.
Yeah. Whereas 5 years for me at this point is a drop in the bucket.
And and I should say that's also true for adjuncts. Like someone who's only here for a semester doesn't know how, doesn't feel as included to be a faculty member using this space. So there's different factors for sure. And I love this conversation about big versus small institution, but it's also it just shows how much work we have to do.
I just will say that I think the amount of sort of crossover from the department you're in into the professional media world impacts that greatly, because at Indiana University, the communications program, which is what they called it, was basically telecommunications. Also ran the Southern Indiana PBS station out of the department. So on the one hand, you got amazing experience as a television in a television environment because you actually had to do that. But on the other hand, they didn't mix outside of the programs because they kind of viewed themselves as a professional group. And they were mystified when I wanted to bring in one of my roommates was in the dance program, and I wanted to bring the dance crew in to film a dance program in the studio. And it took a lot of persuasion to convince them to let me bring somebody in from the dancing program. And then they loved it and kept showing it to everybody. But, it's sort of like that. The little places aren't as siloed, except UCLA is well represented here. The UCLA animation program was like a small school in the middle of a big university, and it was run that way by Dan McLaughlin. So there was anybody who had any extra skills, like being able to talk to camera people and get permission to use the films, the camera studios to do stuff, could share that with other people, and suddenly, you had a new place that opened up for everybody.
Yeah,
So
obviously, I have my own tangential UCLA connection. I was at UCLA Extension for a little while. But one of the things that I don't know if it will be in the article exactly, but we are interested in sort of the genealogies of that, which is seeing how things go from one university to the other. So we talk a little bit in the paper about LMU and the L'Oreal Marymount labs, and set up obviously a lot UCLA alumni over there running that program for at least a little while. And the same thing between another place we looked at, Sheridan and National Institute of Design in India. They're alumni who go and become teachers, set up their labs and their curricula in ways that mirror or respond to the one that they had. So I think that's relevant too. But it's interesting you mentioned that they don't always go to the same size institution that they left.
No.
And things change dramatically.
Yeah.
I've gone to smaller institutions every time I've moved.
Well, I'll be interested to see what you've gotten when you get it up there. And if I find things that I want to send, suggest and talk to you, I'll be happy to be connected to. So
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
done.
We're we're nearing the end of our time. If anybody has any quick question, please just ask. If not, I'll just turn it over to Tim and Andrew for some final thoughts.
Yeah, so I guess probably the big thing, you can, if you have questions or comments, or if you want to get involved with us, you can get a hold of me at jonest@rmu.edu, or another place you can find me, our related project is spiritedanimation.com, a podcast that we make in this space, actually to do with animated text and involving our students and folks on questions of animation content and community and spirituality. So there's a number of projects. You can get in touch with us. Like I said, jonest@rmu.edu.
Yeah, mine's Ames, AMES at rmu.edu.
And yeah, we're really excited to talk further. Anyone, any questions, comments? If you think there's an opportunity for a case study or a conversation about your institution or someone else we should talk to, we'd love to. And again, I guess the most important thing to do is just, we really want to thank ASIFA-Hollywood and the Animation Educators Forum for pushing us in this direction, and for Kevin for inviting us here to talk about it with you. Yep. It's been, a really, as we're talking about inclusive communities, it's been a great community to be a part of. So we're really excited about that.
Yeah,
great. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you both. Just as a reminder, upcoming, our next animation salons will be in April 7th with Sheila Sofian, who will be talking about her short film that is going to be making the festival circuits just right now, called Disabled: A Love Story. And in July, Tabitha Fisher will be talking about the production of her film, Hey Men. And both of them are past Animation Educator Forum faculty grant awardees as well. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.